I'm Bob Brown, and I have spent the last almost 80 years in the state of Maine, starting in Augusta, Maine. And Augusta was where I was born. My dad owned a seafood market. My mom was a RN. And at about the age of 2, we headed to Connecticut as the war was going on, and my mother worked in the airplane factory, and my father worked in the ball bearing factory. And I was just a youngster, didn't know anything back then. And then we came back to Maine and spent the rest of my growing up years in Augusta. I was very, very lucky to live in the neighborhood that I lived in. It was over by Farrington School, and it was on Davenport Street. And our community was all a bunch of kids. And every day we couldn't wait to get up, to get outdoors and play. And my mother would ring a bell and we'd come home and eat. And then she'd push us out the door and away we'd go, and the bell would ring at about 5:30 and away we'd come for supper and then out the door again. And it was a whole neighborhood of youngsters just having fun. And we used to play kick the can and hide and go seek, and we'd play some sort of ball with either basketball or baseball or football, something in the streets. And winter was probably my favorite time because next street over was Fairview Avenue. And they closed Fairview Avenue. It was a long hill. It was about a quarter of a mile. And the city closed it so we could go sliding. And we used to slide every day there. And we'd slide at night there. And the traffic had to go up my street and around and come down the hill. They were not allowed to go up the hill because they'd run us over. And we lived next to an apple orchard. And it was Bill Viles had an apple orchard. And I can remember, this was one of the first lessons my mother taught me, is that I thought it would be real neat to take my little wagon and paper bags and go over to the apple orchard and fill them and then take them around and sell them to the neighborhood. And everybody loved buying my apples for $1 or whatever it was. And when my mother found out, we went down to Bill Viles' house, and I had to tell Bill what I had done, how I stolen his apples and sold them. And I learned a valuable lesson of integrity and honesty way back then. And it's amazing how things like that pop into your head. As far as sports and introduction of sports go, because my whole life has been as a basketball coach or baseball coach or whatever, I can still remember coming down my stairs and looking into the living room and seeing a brand new leather basketball. And it was something that I was dying to have. And it was one of those that had stitches on it, laces, so that it wasn't the rubber kind today and so forth. And my next door neighbor, the Burgesses, had a basketball backboard up. And of course it's wintertime now, and I went over, and that first day I shoveled it off and I played, and I was young enough so I couldn't shoot overhand. I had to shoot underhand. I had to shoot underhand at everything. And I still can remember coming back, and I think if I remember correctly, I was crying because my leather basketball was all wet, and I thought I'd ruined it. Fortunately, I didn't. But as I grew up, I went to Farrington grammar school, and this was fantastic for me because all I did was go out in my backyard, climb over my fence, and there was a school, and there was a playground. And so we all went to the playground and we played every day that wasn't school. And we would play, the good thing about growing up in my time was it wasn't organized. We had to organize. We had to decide what games you play. And when you're going to play baseball and 7 kids there, how do you play it? Or any other sport. And so we played football. We didn't know about flag football, so we played tackle football, and I broke my arm, and that was a little bit of a setback. But that field was ours. And if you see some movies about gangs of kids, young kids, and they have a territory, well, that was our territory. And as I said, I went to Farrington School, and probably there were 2 people there that influenced my life as much as anybody. One was Jack Lee, and Jack Leet was my basketball coach. And I thought he was about as close to God as you could be. And I just worshiped him. And when we were in the 8th grade, in Augusta, there were 8 or 9 grammar schools, and one from Halldale, Mariah Clark, I think it was. And so we'd play each other over at the Augusta Y, a little bandbox of a gym. And I've got the clippings today of the games and how many points we scored and so forth. And we played the season, and we'd lost a game, and then we were playing Smith. And Smith was ahead of us 23-2 at halftime. And the Smith coach felt very sorry for us. And we beat him 24-23. He put in his second team thinking, well, that was their first loss. And then Williams, on the other side of town, played Smith, and they beat him. So we all had 2 losses, but since the best team, which was Smith, they had to play, they were out of the playoffs. It was just Williams and us. And it came down to Mo Stickney. I think that's a name that you remember. And Mo made a last-second shot. We were down by 1, and he shot. The ball was in the air. We won, and history was made. You know, and the feeling. Anybody who plays sports, who were brought up in that environment, it's special. I can just remember going to the YMCA and playing sports, and it just was so enthusiastic approach to life, getting involved with those. Got to go back to Farrington because Ella Hudgkins was my 8th grade teacher, and Ella Hudgkins was the best English teacher I ever had, and I don't know if I ever learned more than what she taught me. She was known for that. And to this day, Ella, thank you. I can talk grammatically correct most of the time. And so, and also, things have changed so much from the time I was at Farrington. I played baseball, and my dad, who owned the fish market, would drive up at 2 o'clock, whenever school was out, and the baseball team would climb in the back of the fish truck, and we'd go play somebody. And you can imagine today, in an open back of a fish truck, taking a bunch of kids, everybody would be sued or something terrible would happen. But that's how our transportation was my dad's fish truck. And so at that time, playing those sports, Little League came to Maine. Little League came to Augusta. And I was just at the tip age where you could play. So we went out and we tried out, and I still remember going to Capitol Park, and there were, it seems like 1,000 kids there, and everybody had to try out. And I was 4'10", and I weighed 98 pounds, and I was a catcher. So you can imagine all the catching equipment was bigger than me. But I was picked for one of the teams, and Purrington Brothers. How's that from memory? Okay, so we played, and there was a player that played from Hollowell by the name of Art Avor. And at that time, you just played. There was no real protective equipment for players. Well, Bob Brown got hit in the head, right on the temple, down, out cold, and that was the first instance of we better get helmets. Next week, they got helmets because I was home in bed for 2 weeks. I couldn't get out of bed because of the concussion. Well, later that year, in the 8th grade, we were in line, like most kids, as you're out on the playground, you're in line to take part in something. Well, the kid in front of me was pushing the kid in front of him. So the kid in front of him turned around and swung at him. He ducked, and I got hit. Concussion number 2, back in the bed. And that limited some of the, I would have tried to play football. I'm sure I couldn't because I was so small. But from that point, I went on to Coney High. And as I go back to my 8th grade, 7th grade year, we used to go down to Coney High School to watch Dave Rand and Bobby Pickett and Bob Sumi and George Terrio and all the kids that played for the Coney High Rams. And I can remember standing in the corner. This is what we do every time before a game. I'd go down, and as you looked out on the court, I can still visualize it. You looked out on the court, they would always warm up in the far end, and I'd go down and stand in the corner and wait till a ball came. And when a ball would come, then I could shoot it and try to make it, And the guys that I just mentioned, they were great to me, because every now and then they'd sort of shovel me a pass and I could shoot it. But I look forward to going down to Coney High School and playing in that gym. Then when I went to high school, I started playing and was on the freshman team. We played in that little bandbox of a gym and thought it was fantastic. So I played basketball, followed the sports, and I played baseball. I also played a little golf when the golf team needed somebody, and ran on a relay team when the track team needed somebody. So I had great sports background and love of the sports. And then sophomore year played JVs, and then the next 2 years played varsity. And there were 5 of us. They called us the the Fabulous Five or something, because Phil Clark, our coach, never took us out unless the game was out of hand. And our junior year, I think we won 4 games. Our senior year, we made it to the tournament and played Stearns in the Bangor Auditorium. And when I coached in high school in the state of Maine, I always tried to tell the kids that special feeling of walking onto the Bangor Auditorium with the crowd on both sides and playing in that game. And I can still remember the game. I still remembered one of the parts I remember was we were down by, I think we were down by 2, and I drove to make the layup, and they called me for a charge, and I think we lost by 3 or 4. And so I remember that. I remember a dog running across the floor in the middle of the game. I have a picture home of us playing in the game, and there's a dog running across the floor in the Bangor Auditorium. So I try to tell my players, this is something you will always remember. And I look back, and I saw a picture the other day of the 5 guys, and only 2 of us are still alive. But we were close. And I look back and ask myself, why did I end up coaching? I love sports, but so did you. So did a lot of people. But to end up coaching, Charlie Arbor was my JV basketball coach, and he was the second coming of God. Jack Lee was first, and then Charlie Arbor. And I wanted to be Charlie Arbor because I knew how the kids respected him, how they liked him, how he carried himself. He was character personified. And later in my coaching career, I went back and coached at Coney, and Charlie Arbor was the principal. Died and gone to heaven. That was very special for me. So that was the beginning of my love affair in getting into coaching. I wanted to go to Farmington. I wanted desperately to go to Farmington. I wanted to be a teacher. I wanted to be a coach. And my mother was a very strong person. She said, Robert, you are going to Boston University, and you're going to study business, because that's where you can make a lot of money. So I said, okay, Mom. So I went to Boston University, and I snuck in some education courses on the side so that when I graduated, I could teach. And I remember getting out of Boston University, and an insurance firm in Augusta asked me to come and work with them. And my mother said, that's fantastic. No, I ended up at Belgrade High School, and 57 kids in the whole school, and no gym, but baseball, we could play baseball. The farm boys could hit a baseball. They could throw a baseball. I coached there 3 years, and we won the championship 2 of those 3 years. And I can still remember the last baseball game I coached. It was a championship game, and it came down to the 7th inning, and I'm not exaggerating. My kid hit a ball, and it was one of these fields that just keep going, no fence. And when he crossed home plate, the winning run, the kid was still chasing the baseball because it split the outfielders and kept rolling. It was fantastic. So I hopped on board at Belgrade, taught 6 different subjects in high school, because with 57 kids, you still got to give them everything. So I taught general math and commercial math and psychology and economics and world history and science. That was the first year. The second year, I taught 4 different ones. I kept the 2 math ones. Loved it. I'd park my little Volkswagen out back, and get out and get in the car at night. There'd be pound cakes or blueberry cake or something. The kids were fantastic, just absolutely loved it. But Belgrade was unique, and some of the, as I said, we had no gym, so we used to, Harold Elfon had a place on one of the Belgrade lakes, and he had a barn, and the top part of the barn, he had all pine paneled, and we'd go up there, and that's where we'd practice. The problem was that you couldn't take a shot outside the foul line because the ceiling was too low. And after we'd practice in the fall and the winter, we'd get about 30 minutes of running around. The floor would be slick with condensation, and then we'd go over to one of the kids' barns at his house, take the balls, and he had a barn with a beam going across, and we'd have to practice shooting over the beam. And that's how we'd practice that shooting. And then we played in all kinds of different courts. And I remember there was one court, literally happened in a game. The kid drove in, took a layup. Somebody was coming in the door. He ended up in a snowbank. And that was kind of unique. We played in a gym that there was only one light in the gym. It was a chandelier in the middle of a Grange Hall, and that was the gym. We played in another gym where when we shot at this, they had a balcony, and the opposing team, their kids would be up on the balcony, and when we come down to shoot, they'd jump up and down, and they'd shake the basket. Then second half, they'd all go to the other end when we'd shoot at that end. And I think, though, my favorite was I would call the kids together, and I'd say, okay, I'm going to call timeout. In about 2 minutes, when I do, all of you run to the middle of the gym, because there was a radiator there, and that was the only heat in the entire building. So we'd get the hot air coming on us. Belgrade was fun. We didn't win many basketball games, but we won baseball games. And I loved the kids. And then from there, I went on and coached at a number of different high schools, Coney High School, Rockland High School, Williams High School. Obviously, you know about that. And then I ended up at South Portland High School. And I think the thing with coaching is, do you end up with good kids? That's number one. Good quality kids who will listen and be instructed and try to play hard and have character. Number two, hopefully they have talent. And now if you have a combination of really great kids with talent, you can do some wonderful things. And at South Portland, I had great kids. I would say that every high school that I ever went and taught at, there was only one that some of the kids were suspect. I'm not going to mention which high school that was, but 2 or 3 of them ended up in prison. And they would come from a tough socioeconomic background, and it was a tough community. But when they were on the floor with me, they were good. They were good kids. At South Portland, we won a few championships, and my son was a pretty good player, went on to Boston University to play for Rick Pitino. And so Rick came to a lot of our practices and was very young then, and he asked me to go and be an assistant with him. So I hopped on board at Boston University with Brett's last 2 years at BU and 2 years with Rick. Then I went to St. Anselm College and took over. When they offered me the job, I looked at and I said, is this true? And they said, what? I said, right now there are 206 Division II teams in America, and you're ranked last. And they said, yes. And it wasn't the coach's fault. They didn't have scholarships. But I said, will you give me scholarships? They did. And luckily, I ended up with some good kids again, and we ended up making the NCAAs in 3 years. And that was a good thing. Then my dad was not well, and so I came back to Maine and coached at Edward Little High School. And I was there for a year, and then the University of Southern Maine job opened up, and I inherited and brought in a couple of Maine kids. I'm not sure what it is about Maine. I've got to go back. I've got to regress back to my junior year in high school. We got a television first television. And televisions weren't very popular then, they were just coming out. And I can remember sitting in front of that television, and they were televising the games from the Bangor Auditorium. And I can remember not Jonesport, Beals, they were Beals back then. And there were 7 kids in the high school. 6 played, and 1 was the manager. 6 boys in Beals High, and they're playing. And it's snow. There's snow all over the screen, and I'd be squinting and about 3 inches trying to figure out what's going on. And they televised every game there, and I would be sitting in front of that. That was me and a love affair with Maine basketball, Maine communities, Maine people. I don't think, I'm not sure how to explain it, but when you think of these small communities and you think, and even the large communities, and what it means to be a part of the program and to represent your school and represent your community, and its family. It's a way of life. I think that was more true when I coached in Eastern Maine than in Western Maine, but it still existed. I remember when one year we won the state at South Portland, and we played in Bangor and won the state there, and we stayed overnight in Bangor, and then on the way home, I knew they were going to have a parade for us. What I didn't know was it started at the Turnpike. Now, if you know where the Turnpike gets off in South Portland, there were cars and people lined up that whole length, up by what was the Mary Manor, all the way down. There were people and cars and honking, and my kids, their mouths were open. They were looking out the window. They were unbelievable. They had never seen anything like this. And then we walked into the gym, and the gym was sold out. It was packed. And they gave us this rally. And you realized how important it was to them that their boys competed in a high-class manner and won a championship. And this was taking place all over the state of Maine. And being an old guy, I remember back to Ellsworth with Jack Scott and Eads and Willie and so forth. Those guys back in, and I think it was 55, but I'm not sure. They closed the town. They rented a train. They closed the town, rented a train, and went to Boston to play in the New Englands, this little Maine team. It's like the movie Hoosiers, except they didn't win it. I think they won a game. But there's something about sports and Maine that it grabs you. And I know that every day that I wake up now, I always look at Maine sports and what Maine kids. I don't follow baseball anymore, but every day I look for the Orioles and I look for Ryan Flaherty because he's a Maine kid. The coach at USM, his son. And so I always look to see how he does. So I look at anybody from Maine that is in sports, that it's a feeling that you have. Anybody who has really been in coaching in a community like this knows what it is like. And it sometimes can be brutal, and sometimes it can be nirvana. It all depends on how well everybody is doing. From South Portland, from USM, I inherited a bunch of Maine kids. One of my favorite players was Jeff Bowers. And Jeff Bowers went to South Portland, and his father was my 7th grade coach in Rockland. They moved to Gorham. But Jeff wanted to play for me at South Portland, so they figured out it would be legal to come to South Portland because Gorham didn't have a shop course, and South Portland did. So they had to allow him to come to South Portland. Well, unfortunately for Jeff, I left after his sophomore year. Well, when I got the USM job, Jeff had already gone to Southern Maine, and whatever reason, it didn't work out for him. He went to Maine to play for Skip Chappelle, and Skip said, "Who are you?" And he said, "I'm Jeff Bowers." He said, "Oh, okay." And Jeff's feelings were hurt. He came back. So my first thing I did was I found Jeff Bowers in the Maine Mall selling shirts. And I said, "Jeff, guess what?" He said, "What?" "You sold your last shirt. You're coming with me to Southern Maine." I'm the new coach, and you're coming to play for me. He said, okay, coach. His senior year, he was the #1 foul shooter in all of college basketball, Division I, II, and III in the United States. He was an All-American. He probably was the best shooter I ever had at any level. And so Jeff hopped on board. I inherited Pat Moody, who was, they should put a statue up for character, and it would have him standing there. He was one of my point guards. Todd Miranda, Tim Bonsant was an All-American. And my second year at USM, I'm sitting in my office, I think it was September 1st, and I get a knock on the door. And it's Mrs. Bonsant, Mr. Bonsant, Tim. And they said, we want him to transfer to Southern Maine. I said, oh, really? I said, school's starting 2 days from now. And they said, well, we figured you probably could help us out. I says, okay, let's do it. And by 5 o'clock at night, he had a room, he had his studies, he had everything all set, and he was the missing piece. And with his strength and his ability inside, along with Jeff and Todd and Pat and the others, we made it to Final Four. Tim was from Erskine Academy, and Pat was from Wells, and Todd was from Portland. Jim Raftis was from Cape Elizabeth, and somebody's going to, and of course Jeff was originally from Rockland. And I had one player from out of state, and he was a young man from Savannah, Georgia, who, talk about a lifestyle. He had somebody down there knew me and said, I have a player here, and I'd like to come play for you, and I know you'll take care of him. And so Dougie came, hopped on a train, and came to Portland, Maine, and Steve Miller, who played for me at South Portland long ago, took him in, gave him a job painting, and Doug Harmon, he never started for me, and he was an African American, and here he is in pretty white place, and he stuck with it. And his sophomore year, at the end of his sophomore year, he came in. I said, Doug, I hate to tell you, but I'm leaving. I have the Boston University job, and I'm not going to be here. And so we had a little heartfelt talk, and I said, but you got to promise me one thing. You came here to get an education. When he was a freshman, his mother called him up almost every week to say, come home, you got to come home, you got to come home. And no, I'm going to get my education, Mom. And I said, you got to promise me that you will get your degree. He said, Coach, I promise you. Well, I'm sitting down at Boston University, and I didn't have very much success at Boston University. And one day I get this package in the mail, and it was his, I'm going to get emotional. It was his diploma. And he said, Coach, I promised you, and here it is. And that was pretty special. So anyways, I was off at Boston University, and after 4 years, they called me in and said, basically, you haven't won enough games, you're going to go home. And I said, okay, goodbye, and I went home. And it took me about 2 years to realize I wasn't as bad as I had thought that day, or as that they thought I was. And so I came home, and part of my contract was I couldn't take another job if they were going to, they had to fulfill the contract. And at the end of that, I had gone over to Australia, and one of the pro coaches had me come over and help put his team together in Tasmania. Love Tasmania. Love Tasmania because it has fantastic fishing. And this brings me back to another regression. When I was very little, my dad, who grew up at Somerset Junction, just a little bit south of Moosehead Lake, in the middle of the woods, he used to take me fishing. And when I was about 4 or 5, he'd put me in a backpack basket, and we'd go up to Canada Falls, and we'd walk down the trail, and he'd carry me in, and then he'd tie rope around me, and tie me to a tree, because we were on a bank end. And if I fell in, I mean, there's running water and so forth, it'd be goodbye, Bobby. So I tied me, and I'd sit there with a pole, and I'd catch trout. And sometimes they would still be, at that point, they were still running logs, and there'd be logs all over the place. You'd sit there, and then the logs would open, you'd put your line in, and you'd catch fish, but the logs would close. Then you'd have to wait until they opened again to pull the trout out. But I couldn't wait to go fishing with my dad, and also bird hunting. Those are the two things that, as you remember your dad and things that you did, that was my dad. That was hunting and fishing. Anyways, I'm off back to Tasmania, and Tasmania, we put the team together, and then I came back to Maine and took over the Bonnie Eagle job. Fantastic kids. And the funny part about it, I had one kid that was one of the best players I ever coached, a kid by the name of James Sereno. And he had trouble with his academics, and I used to go out there at about 5:45 in the morning and teach him how to study. And God love him, he ended up making the honor roll. So it was just a question of study. But I always told him, and he says, James, you and I, we're the two dumbest kids on the team, because everybody else was on college boards was 1,300 and above. And so I inherited a very intelligent team. But the people out there, and I called it Bonnie Eagle land, the people out there, my players out there for 3 years, I couldn't have asked for anything better. We made it to the Western Maine finals and a couple semifinals, but they were good kids. And that was great. And then from there, I headed off to Australia again, because my son was, at that time, assistant coach for the Australian Olympic team. And he was also the head coach of the Sydney Kings in their professional basketball league. So he had me come over and coach his team while he coached in the 2000 Olympic Games. So I was over there, and I stayed there for that year. And that was an experience. And Aussie basketball, if you know Aussie at all, you know what kind of people they are. They're tough, they're rugged, they're drinking buddies, they're out partying, they're having fun, they love life. But when they're serious, watch out. They're coming after you. And so that was a good year. And I came back, and Chevrolet's job was open, and Danny Costigan called me and says, you ought to look into that Chevrolet's job. And I said, well, it's pretty tough. The parents over there are pretty tough. And he says, yeah, but you ought to look into it. And now, Chevrolet's was my number one hate group. When I was at South Portland, when I was at Bonnie Eagle, I didn't dislike Chevrolet's. I hated Chevrolet's. I hated everything about them. And it was at the time when I was coaching, there wasn't, all these kids didn't play AAUs. They're all friends. They all get together. They go out and shake hands. They say, how you doing? Nobody liked each other. And of all the teams that South Portland hated, it was Chevrolet's. And so I said, I don't know if I could possibly ever coach there. And so I said, all right, I'll go talk to them. And so I talked to Father Keegan, and wonderful man. He sold me on the school and sold me that I would be accepted there and so forth. And I made no bones. I said, Father, this is going to be tough, because I really don't like you people over here, and partly because you've been so good, and the competition and so forth. And so I promised him I'd stay 3 years, and I actually stayed. I said, I promise you 3, I'll try 5. I stayed 11, and loved the kids, loved the place, everything about it. But I can remember it came out in the paper that I took the job, and I was at Shaw's in South Portland, and I happened to run into Ralph Baxter, who was the principal of South Portland. And we talked for about 20 minutes. He never mentioned a thing about me taking the job. And finally I said, okay, I'll see you later. He said, by the way, if you think I'm congratulating, I'm not. I think it's a lousy move. And he turned around and walked away. And that was the feelings that we had. Through my, even today, there's something special about Maine basketball. It's not just Maine boys, it's Maine girls. It's the way they compete. It's the whole attitude. I know tomorrow night I'm coming in here to see the Gorham girls play, and it's just special. And I can remember, we're going back to girls, when I first started coaching, it was 3 at one end of the court, 3 at the other end. Girls weren't tough enough to be able to play up and down the court. And so the girls sort of said, no, 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 no. So they said, all right, one of you can go over and one of you can go back. And don't forget, you only can dribble the ball twice, and then you have to pass it. Okay. So finally the evolution came where the girls were allowed to play 5-on-5. And the other night, Duke was playing and somebody else was playing, and the Yukon girls were playing. And I watched the Yukon girls, and I thought that was fantastic. And everywhere in Maine, in these small communities, there are special kids and special stories. And I think one of the ones I remember involved Dick Meter and Bobby Meter. Dick Meter is the coach at University of Maine, Farmington. Bobby Meter was an official. Okay, they were at Solon. And back when I was at Belgrade, you had to win your region to go to the state game, to go to the Bangor Auditorium. You couldn't just have a good season and do it by record. Well, there was a little school over on the left side called Anson Academy, not from North Anson. And there was a kid by the name of Booba that played there. And I think they split during the regular season, and they had to play off. The winner goes to the tournament. And these are 2 of the best teams in Eastern Maine. And Lee Poliquin, who was an official, was doing the game. And the crowds, now this is small town America, and the crowds are rabid, and they're into it. And it comes down, and it's a 1-point ball game, and North Anson wins. And the cops surround the officials to get them out. One of the mothers was so mad, she got down on her hands and knees, crawled between the cops, and bit Lee Poliquin on the leg. And this is Maine basketball. And so that's really, I guess that's Bob Brown in a quick synopsis. I think one of the things that I've been very, very fortunate in is that both of my kids, my daughter and my son, have grown up in Maine and have seen the work ethic of Maine, and through the coaching have seen the character that is important. Because every time they come home at night, if some kid didn't act right and so forth, the great example of lack of character would be brought up. So both of my children were fortunate enough to have been brought up in an environment of life and life lessons of what it takes to succeed, what it takes to be yourself. I think one of the things that I really feel that my wife, who was an educator, and truthfully, she's probably the one who gave the kids their personality. I probably helped with the work ethic. But I think that the thing that we instilled in them was feelings for other people, concern for other people, doing things well, doing them right, and always doing it with character, having empathy for other people in their situations. And I know that as a coach, what people say, well, what was your strength? And I think more than anything is that my philosophy of coaching was teach life skills through the medium of basketball. I always told my players, if you do it right, the scoreboard will take care of itself, but that's not what is important. And even today, I get letters, I get emails from kids that say, thank you, coach, and they tell me what they have done. And I remember a kid, when I took over the St. Anselm job, I had a big kid, 6'10", and Dave DeStito, and he was playing so-so and, playing 6'10", but not really getting much done. And I told him, we're going to have tryouts, Dave. And because you were on last year's team doesn't mean you're going to make this year's team. And this is what you have to do. 100 times in a row, you've got to go up and touch the rim with your right, touch the rim with your left, touch the rim with 2, and don't stop in 100. He looked at me and he said, you serious, coach? I said, yeah, I'm serious. You've been out there in the uniform and you haven't been playing. Now you're going to be a player. And so I said, 1 week for tryouts, we're going to do this. And so he came, and he got to 90, 91, 92. He got to 97. He couldn't do it. He just fell down. And I said, Dave, that is absolutely fantastic. You are going to do it. I'm going to give you 4 days off. I don't want you to do anything. You come in 4 days. In 4 days, now my other players on my team knew, and in 4 days, he came in with about 7 or 8 of his teammates, and they cheered every single jump, and he got to 100. And he, all of a sudden, here's this kid who was like this, now blossomed. And now he became a player. But more important, he became somebody as a powerful human being. At the end of his senior year, what are you going to do, Dave? He says, I want to be a pilot coach. And I said, well, can you? He says, I can't. They won't let me. My backbone is too long, and I can't fit in the cockpit. And he says, so I'm going to go to Naval Training School. I said, okay. So I get this call from him. He's down there, and he said, Coach, you aren't going to believe this. There's kids from Harvard, Yale, and all these Ivy Leagues and everything, and they're dropping out left and right and right. I says, is it that hard? Coach, compared to you, it's a piece of cake, no problem. And so he graduated. He went in, and I can remember I was walking down to DeMillo's to go to lunch, and I get this call, and it's Dave. He said, Coach, I'm going to get emotional again. Coach, he said, I wanted you to know I'm captain of a ship, and I'm walking on board, and I want to thank you for this. And I thought, life lessons. This is all about becoming as good as you can possibly be. And my kids saw that every day. And they you know, along the way, it wasn't always a bed of roses. I had kids that ended up having to be kicked off because they did wrong things. But those were valuable lessons for my own as we went along. The other day, probably a couple of years ago, I got a letter from a girl that I had at Girls Swish Camp. And she said, I'm sending you a picture I wanted you to see. She said, do you remember the fat lecture you gave? I remember it because I was fat. And because I stood up in front and told all the girls about what would hold them back from becoming an athlete, and one would be being overweight. And she said, I remember that. I lost that year. I lost almost 30 pounds, and I had 2 good years of high school basketball. And this is what I look like now, and I wanted to thank you for it. But you never know. And you never know what you're going to say that is going to be meaningful to youngsters. And hopefully, and when I talk to coaches, and I get coaches that call me, and coaches that come, both college and high school today, and we talk about coaching. And the first thing today, there are 2 things that are so different today than when I started, okay? You're going to say one of them, I know. The second one, you won't get. The first one is parents. The parent involvement today is brutal. And you have to inform and educate the parents as to what you're doing, why you're doing it. And that's the way the world is today. Back when I first started coaching, if I said anything, it was automatic. It was, Coach said it, we do it, and that's the end of it. Everybody's going to have spaghetti for supper. That's right, Coach said it, we're having spaghetti for supper. Not true today. It's, you got to justify it, and so forth. So today's coaching is a lot harder in the beginning than it was for me when I started. The second thing is, way back when I first started having teams, I always believed that we all wore the same sneakers because we were a team. I didn't want black and white and yellow and green. We're a team. We're going to dress alike. And so I used to order sneakers. I used to order 8s. I used to order 8.5. In probably the last 10 years at Chevrolet, I never ordered a size 8 sneaker, never ordered a size 8.5. It was all 9 and above. The 8.5s were gone. Why? I don't know. I think it's just that people are bigger now than they were back then. And those are 2 things that are very different from when I started. Yeah. I think in everybody's life as a coach, there are people that have been a part of your life, and there have been people that have been very special in situations, and I've been extremely fortunate that I've been in rooms talking basketball with some of the world's finest, like Dean Smith and John Wooden and Gino Auriemma and so forth. And I sat down for 2 or 3 days, and we've talked basketball. And I can remember going down with Dean Smith, and we got in a room. There was Dean Smith, Larry Brown, John Custer, and me. And there's 4 of us. And I thought going down that I was going to listen to Dean Smith. He was going to tell me all about basketball. And he says, first of all, this is not a Dean Smith clinic. We're going to talk basketball. And he says, Brownie, he says, John tells me you really do something special against handling pressure. Put it on the board for me. Well, I almost swallowed my tongue and thinking, I'm in the presence of Dean Smith, who's close to being God in the basketball world, and the respect that he showed me and so forth. And it was fantastic. And I told him, I said, Dean, this worked for me when teams press 1, 2, 1, 1. A lot of times they'll put the big man all the way back. And so what we do is when they do that, one of my guards is responsible for setting a pick on him, screen on him, so he can't run back. Then we run somebody and throw it over the top. And he said, hey, I've never heard that. That sounds good. So now I go to the Final Four at the end of the year, and I'm walking down one of the corridors, and all of a sudden, hey, Brownie, it worked. We did it against Wake Forest. And I said, I felt like $1 million. And I said that was kind of special. And my travels, I've been to Finland, and I've been to Tasmania, I've been to Australia, I've been to New Zealand, I've been to Greece, through the world of basketball. And all of these are people who have included me in clinics and so forth. And I can remember Greece, it was like a rock star, stood up on a stage, and those big screens on the left and the right, as I'm diagramming and I'm talking, and then they're interpreting, and then I'm talking, and then they're interpreting. We all have headphones on, and then at the end they're asking me questions, and it's interpreting, and I'm thinking, this is amazing. And I looked out the other day and watched San Antonio, the Spurs play. Well, the assistant coach for the Spurs now is a coach by the name of Messina, who was the Italian national coach, who was in that clinic with Dean Smith and myself. And one of the clinics we put on in Athens was in the Coliseum, and worked with a team in the Coliseum. And I'm thinking, all of these things have evolved from little Bobby Brown standing in a corner at Coney High School gym, shooting shots and looking up to, Dave Ram, Bobby Pickett, and all of those guys. And I think, how lucky am I to have been able to live this life, and all of the people that have been a special part of that life. And I think the one thing that has carried me always is feeling for the people in front of me that they were important, and that my job was to help them feel better and more positive about themselves, feel confident about themselves. And that was my goal. So whatever success I've ever had, it would be because those people had the character to absorb some of the things that I was trying to teach, and together we had fun. After going over all of this, I come to remember that important part of coaching. I think back to 1960, and I knew nothing, absolutely nothing about coaching and what you should do. But somewhere along the line, I learned that coaching was really about teaching life lessons. And one of the most important things in life lessons is family. And I think that along the line, my teams always have been strong with a family feeling. And I tried to teach that always. And I think, how lucky was I in my own life with my family. I married a young lady whose name was Bonnie Brown, so we always call her Bonnie Brown Brown. And she, in her own right, was a huge success. She was a second, third grade teacher, and she won awards, Teacher of the Year in the school system, and she's even listed in Who's Who in American Teachers. So in her own right, outside of the athletic world, she was a winner. And I think with the two of us, we were able to instill that family importance in our two children, Barbara and Brett. Brett grew up in athletics and is now in the coaching field and has done well. And Barbara was a graduate of St. Anselm College, and she was a stay-at-home mom with 4 kids who all have turned out tremendously well. And I ought to mention them, and Anna and Elena, Caroline, and Ridge, and all have gone on to college and played sports. And their interests, their father, Brian Driscoll, was a hockey player for Brown, so they grew up in the world of hockey, and lo and behold, 3 of them are playing lacrosse in college. Don't ask me how that happens, but it happens. And Brett married a girl from Australia, and he has 3 children, one of which is in a special needs program at Yale, and another is a student at Georgetown, and the last of the Brown lineage is Sam. And Sam is right now he is a 7th grader, and he, like his father, loves basketball. So the family aspect of my teams and our approach has carried over to my own family. And I think how lucky I am that that importance of togetherness and thinking of other people has been passed on to my kids and my grandchildren. So I think Bob Brown has had a pretty fortunate life, and right now things are going pretty well.